Now I kind of opened with this, and since we're a little over 2 hours right now,
come on.
I said that you're probably the most responsible individual for this podcast, and because you originally through Kirk set me up to do a podcast with Tim Ferriss, which sent me up to do a podcast with Joe Rogan, which was just all awesome. And both those guys told me I should do my own podcast. So anyone that's listening to this podcast, say thanks to Peter for that.
Actually, they should thank Kirk, right?
Because Kirk was the man.
You know, I mean, Kirk is, I don't need to tell you, but Kirk's one of those guys where, like, he doesn't have to justify and ask, right? So when he introduced me to you, he didn't have to explain. He was just like, I want you to meet Jocko. Jocko's my friend. I was like, that's good enough. And so, you know, to me, like, that's the measure of when life is good. And because I feel that way with all of my friends. Like, if Tim introduces me to somebody, like Tim's introduced me to like a dozen people, a dozen amazing relationships have come out of that, right? And so, you know, really, it was just very easy for me to sort of take Kirk on his word that, like, if Jocko's a great guy, then that's all I need to know. I knew you're going to be a great guy. And then similarly, like, I could tell Tim, like, hey, you got to meet Jocko. And you know, Tim gets quote unquote pitched all day long.
Yeah, he does.
But you know, he knows that I'm not going to send him somebody that's not, you know, going to be really interesting and going to benefit his listeners, not just, you know, whatever agenda that person might have.
Yeah. No, it was awesome, and that really did. I mean, the way Tim advised the way he was going to release the podcast in order to support the book. I mean, he just nailed it. It was kind of ridiculous the way he understands that stuff and how helpful it was to, you know, getting our book out there and getting it sold and all that, and getting all these people on board. And then, you know, that turned into this podcast, which, you know, he definitely has promoted the podcast in a fantastic way along with Joe. So that's both been awesome. But again, started with Kirk connecting me with you, and then you connecting me with Tim. So appreciate that. And speaking of this podcast, my almost silent partner over here, Echo Charles, if somebody wants to support the podcast, how would you recommend they go ahead and do that?
You always wait. I have a question.
Oh.
How'd you hurt your back originally?
You know, I don't think we ever really have a diagnosis. There was certainly nothing on that day that I did. That day I'm riding my bike to the gym. I think about the sins of my youth. You know, I was really into martial arts in addition to boxing, and I used to spend a ton of time. I was really obsessed with spinning back kicks. Now, I don't know if that could have done it or not. But I used to practice 75 spinning back kicks with each leg every single day for probably about 7 years. It's possible, even though in theory a spinning back kick, if done correctly, should really not put any torque on the lower back. It's much more in your hips, and technically the flexibilities in the thoracic spine, not the lumbar spine. But, you know, God knows, maybe I just wasn't doing those things correctly. I did squat and deadlift really heavy growing up. I did powerlifting as sort of a side sport. But... you know, certainly never hurt myself doing that. I rode crew for a year, and so I've always wondered if that was the most destructive thing I did, because in an 8-man boat, you're asymmetric, right? Yeah. So when you scull, you're symmetric. When you sweep, you're not. And so I was a sweeper, and so I almost wonder if, like, that's the most destructive thing I ever did.
Yeah, and then you'd figure if you're asymmetric like that, your everyday life is asymmetric, really, because you have a little bit of overdevelopment on one side. That might have been it.
So I guess I've never really known, but I take it really seriously today. In fact, you know, Jocko, you'll dig this. 2 weeks ago, I did a video in New York with a friend of mine named Jesse Schwartzman, and he's like, I call him the savant of movement. This guy's like just like the kinesthetic man. And I wanted to put a video together of how do you train to train? How do you prepare your body to train? So it's basically 3 sections. It's what's the sort of dynamic, well, the sort of tissue preparation, the static prep, and the dynamic prep. It took us maybe 6 hours to shoot this video. It'll be edited down into probably 3 10-minute videos, and as soon as they're done editing, I'm just going to throw them up on YouTube and my blog. So I'll make sure you've got a copy.
Awesome.
It's I mean, Jesse's just he walks me through all the exercises. But I get the sense, like, if I had done that stuff all the way in my life, I probably never would have been hurt. And luckily, knock on wood, to this day, I mean, I never thought I'd be able to squat and deadlift again after going through that year of my life. But amazingly, I'm totally fine.
And it was a herniated disc that popped off.
Yeah, so it was an L5-S1 really big herniation, but then a 4 or 5 centimeter fragment broke off and then floats down the canal, and that was sitting on the nerve root. And then I developed a few other problems after. So I developed this thing called a facet arthropathy, which resulted in the feeling of having my testicles torn out from the inside. I'm not even joking. That's just it's just unbearable.
Yeah, I would imagine that's unbearable.
I don't recommend that.
No.